Good morning, everyone. I'm really bad with technology, so we'll see if this works, okay? So as Pilar just said, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what the laws are, but I'm not going to do too much of that because that could be 20 minutes in of itself, and then I'm going to tell you sort of what has come out of the laws thus far. I'm putting my disclosures up on the board for you to read while I talk. The things that I want to point out are that I am probably here because I'm the co-chair of something called the Working Group on Compassionate Use and Pre-Approval Access, which is an international group made up of industry representatives, doctors, nurses, venture capitalists, lawyers, ethicists, et cetera, who look at access to investigational medicines from all different angles. And the point that I have up there that I want you to note is that we are not paid for that work, so it's our independent analysis. And the other thing I want you to note on that disclosure list is that I will say up front right now that I oppose right to try laws. I'm going to try to give you, as best as I can, a sort of straight analysis for the next 20 minutes, but just so that you know where I'm coming from for any bias that I wasn't able to strip out, I oppose these laws. So there we go. And in case this is relevant to anyone in the room, and I assume it is, the working group that I co-chair just had this out in the last 2 weeks, so feel free to check it out. Okay, so as Pilar mentioned, there were state right to try laws before there was a federal right to try law. And so basically, there are 41 laws on the books right now on the state level. Every single one of them is different. So I can't tell you what every single one of them covers, but I can give you sort of a synthesis. And it says if a patient is at the end of their life not eligible for a clinical trial, they may ask a pharmaceutical or biotech company for access to an investigational medical product, only drugs, investigational drug outside of a clinical trial. They have to have a willing doctor who will give them the prescription, and the drug has to have gone through phase 1, quote unquote, safety testing. I prefer to call it dosage setting testing, but whatever. And one of the facts about these state laws that not many people has picked up on the fact is that some of them actually strip patients of various rights, and I'll get back into that in a minute. So those are state right to try laws. They began appearing in 2014, first in Colorado and then sort of spreading throughout the country. This is a picture of the signing in Colorado, not just because it was the first one, but also to point out this is a Democratic governor signing this bill. A lot of people have picked up on the fact that this bill was originally conceived of by the Goldwater Foundation, which is a far-right libertarian organization, which I think is very important. But at the same time, I want to point that on at least the state level, this has been a bipartisan exercise. And here's the map as of today. Everywhere that's shaded currently has a right to try law on the books in the states. Everywhere that's not shaded does not have a law, although that does not mean that, for instance, 2 of those states right now have laws being debated in assembly, so this could change any day. And for anyone who's really interested in finding out more about this model law and how it was successful in getting passed across the spectrum of states so quickly, this article just came out within the last month, and it's exhaustively researched and really amazing, and I recommend it. And I need to grab water. Hold on. All right, so this law was based on a model bill, which again I said was created by a libertarian organization called the Goldwater Institute. And the basic precept of this law you can get from this book. This is the former president of the Goldwater Institute who wrote a book called The Right to Try. And if you look at the subtitle, it spells it out for you. It says, How the Federal Government Prevents Americans from Getting the Life-Saving Treatments They Need. So the goal of this bill was to get the government out of access to investigational medicines. And if you think that this is something that was conceived of with the idea of helping patients, I hate to tell you that that is not correct. This is actually from that book, and where's the pointer? Here's the pointer. If you look right here, it says that this law was conceived of, over there, hello, over there, as a result of a meeting with the Cancer Treatment Centers of America, which, if you don't know who they are, I'll let you Google them, but they are a vastly entrepreneurial chain of hospitals that has been slapped on the hand numerous times for trying to push the boundaries of what they could give patients in terms of experimental medications. And this is the sort of information that was put out by Goldwater to, buy public support for this bill. This says FDA Timeline. This is talking about for cancer. More than 500,000 Americans will die of cancer alone during the multiple years it takes to bring a new drug to market. And so you can see in between phase 1 and phase 2, it says potential patient access through right to try, and then down at the bottom, right to try puts the patients and their doctor back in charge of their treatment decisions. So it's this theme that the government is interfering with your health care, and we need to get the government out so that your doctor and you can make a decision about what's best for you. What is not depicted in this picture, and that I assume other speakers will talk about in more detail, is that there actually is a program that would have given this patient who's waiting for access prior to the drug coming out on market. It's called Expanded Access, and it's been available in the United States in various forms since the 1970s. So this is sort of setting up a false dichotomy between getting access pre-approval or never getting access until approval that does not really exist in reality, because this is not talking about expanded access. And then you can see in little tiny print in between the graphic and the bottom, it says, while hundreds of thousands of people died from terminal diseases last year, less than 1,000 were given permission to access experimental medications in the current system. So that is talking about expanded access, and that number is wrong, which I will come back to. So, as was alluded to by Pilar, this has been a very controversial topic, and there were numerous criticisms, and I'll hit 3 of them. One is, this is from a health lawyer here in DC, which is basically that if you tell people that they're going to have a right to try, it creates a false expectation. The right to try law does not give you a right to try. It gives you a right to ask permission to try. A drug company, a biotech company, a gene therapy company, whoever it is, they own their product, and just because you want to use it doesn't mean that they have to give it to you. And in fact, to make that perfectly clear, there was a court case several years ago that went up to the Supreme Court that actually said, yes, there is no constitutional right to an investigational product. So it creates false expectations. And I'll just jump ahead to the spoiler and say, after the right to try laws got passed, we saw this in spades, that people actually thought that that meant that they could get what they wanted, and were very dismayed to find out that that was not the case. Other criticisms, and this is from my group, were what it actually said in the state laws. Remember, I said every single one of them is different. So this was a colleague and I who did an analysis of, I think it was the first 15 laws, and these are the sort of things that we found. If you got a drug through right to try, you could lose your hospice coverage. If you got a drug through right to try, you could be denied home health care coverage. You could be denied health insurance for up to 6 months after the treatment. And if there was any harm from the investigational product, you can be denied coverage from your insurer. These were not things that were advertised in the sort of glossy campaign that went out to push right to try. And then, of course, the third critique of all of this is, as I alluded to a minute ago, it didn't mention the fact that we already had a perfectly functional program. So this is expanded access. These are the numbers just from the last calendar year. You can see CEDAR, so this is investigational drugs, received 1,305 requests, of which they granted all but 5. CBER received 294 requests, of which they approved 222, and I have an asterisk there because apparently, actually Peter Marks could probably explain this better than I can. But apparently there were numerous single patient requests for one product that the FDA deemed not really suitable for use. So, and what you need to understand about this number, and I said earlier on that sort of graphic from the Goldwater Institute that 1,000 number was incorrect. These are not patients. These are requests. Some requests are for an individual patient, so I have one request for Nadia, but then some requests are for groups, so like I have a request for all of us. And some of those groups actually include thousands of patients. So I don't know the number of patients that are reached by expanded access, but I know that that is less than the number, because that would assume that every one of those requests equaled one patient. And we know that for at least half of those requests, it was more than one patient. Sometimes 2 patients, sometimes 10 patients, sometimes 500 patients, sometimes 1,000. So I don't know the actual number, but I know it's more than that. And so what this points out is that, just looking at these numbers, it's not really the FDA that is saying no to patients. The vast majority of requests that come into the FDA says, okay, you can go ahead and try this. So if people are perceiving that there is a lack of access to investigational medicines, you need to go back a step before the FDA and say, well, what is preventing requests from getting to the FDA? Because once they get to the FDA, this is not a big obstacle. And so this is a nice infographic that the Office of the Chief Medical Advisor at Johnson & Johnson did. It's on their website. You can look at it. But it basically breaks down the stages of doing an expanded access request. And you can see, prior to the FDA getting involved, the company has to approve the request. And even prior to the request getting to the company, you have to have a willing physician. So I would argue, and I think many other people would argue, that if you perceive that not enough people are getting access to investigational drugs, you need to intervene on these levels. Either figure out why physicians are not willing to put in the request, or figure out why companies are not willing to grant it, and that it's not the FDA that's the problem. And of course, that's the criticism of Right to Try, is that it solely carved out the FDA and said the FDA is the problem, we need to get government out of access. But the numbers support that that's not actually the problem. So then the question is, why did people so willingly glom onto the idea that the FDA was a problem if the numbers didn't support it? And I think many people in the room sort of have this in your memory, the HIV/AIDS patients protest of the 1980s, saying that the FDA has restricted access to investigational drugs to the point that you are regulating us to death. Let us try risky things because we don't really have an alternative. And I would say that was something that happened in the 1980s. The FDA of today is exceedingly different. So yes, this is true history, but it's not something that we need to use to be evaluating current policy. And of course, it's not just those of us who have this in our sort of personal memory banks. It's movies like this that perpetuate this idea. This is a fictionalized retelling. I don't know how many of y'all saw the Dallas Buyers Club, or at least are familiar with it. But it's a fictionalized retelling in which the Buyers Clubs are, these sort of anti-regulatory heroes who are breaking the laws to save patients' lives. And in reality, the Buyers Clubs that did exist in the United States actually had a partner at the FDA who helped them get these drugs legally. So, and it's a fiction. And another reason that people bought into this idea that the FDA was an obstacle is because you had a very beautifully done emotional ad campaign from the Goldwater Institute to push this Right to Try idea. They had lots of patient narratives that were very emotive and gripping. This is an example of one right here, Diego Morris. And they would use these sort of anecdotes and say, these patients can't get drugs that are saving their lives in the United States because of the FDA, which was not true. I just have to tell you, it was not true. In this case, Diego Morris's father was testifying before Congress, and a congressperson said, I think expecting to hear some horror story of FDA recalcitrance, well, what did the FDA say when you asked if you could get this drug? And he said, oh, we never asked. So, I mean, almost, I'll say almost, in case people are feeling litigious or something. But almost every case that Goldwater put up as sort of an anecdote to support the idea that the FDA was an obstacle can be deconstructed if you know the facts behind the case. But be it as it may, it passed, and it's now federal law, and we have to live with it. And it's coming up on its year anniversary. It was named for 4 patients, and that little boy getting hugged is Jordan McLean, one of the patients who was named, and we'll come back to him in a minute. So the claims are that it's going to save lives and it's going to help people. This is Trump's signing statement. Now as I proudly sign, and this is very personal for me, thousands of terminally ill Americans will finally have the help, the hope, the fighting chance, and I think it's going to be better than chance. We're going to help a lot of people. So that's the claim. Here's the reality. So remember, there's state right to try laws and their federal right to try laws, and the state right to try laws for the most part predated the federal. Under the state, about 70 patients got access under the Texas state right to try law, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Under the federal law, we know of 2 patients who have gotten access. One is an oncology patient, one is an ALS patient. I'll come back to them in a minute. And the Goldwater Foundation has said that there's going to be a blooming of cases announced in the first quarter. So any day now, even possibly today, we could find out of new cases. I'm sure they're out there. I have no doubt we're going to learn of more cases, but I remain convinced that this is going to remain a fairly minor number of people who get access through this pathway, and I'm happy to talk about that. The other realities are that there has been massive confusion about what right to try is and offers, and confusion about how the state and federal laws interact. So here's the Texas state experience. I have no idea how to pronounce this drug, so I will not even try. But this is an oncology agent that has since been approved by the FDA. At the time that it was offered to approximately 70 patients under right to try in Texas, it was actually available through an FDA-approved expanded access program. So these were not patients who did not have access to the drug. These are patients who, instead of getting access through the expanded access program, were offered access by one particular doctor at one particular clinic via right to try. And there's a whole disputed backstory about why this clinician chose to use right to try, whether he was even able to enroll patients, et cetera, et cetera. And I just saw Andrew McFadden slide into the back of the room. He's in the back row, and if you have questions, I'll refer you to him because he was actually involved in the case. If you go to Goldwater's website, there are numerous grateful letters from patients who said, you know, I was dying, I got access to this treatment, it bought me a couple more months, and I'm very grateful to the Goldwater Foundation for this. That's true, they did get access, I'm not disputing that, but I am disputing the idea that it was the only way they could have gotten access. They could have gotten access other ways through other doctors. And we also on GoFundMe found numerous examples of those same patients requesting tens of thousands of dollars of donations to help them get access to this drug. And that raises red flags for me because by law, you are not allowed to charge more than recouping your costs for an investigational product. So the fact that these patients were raising large sums of money makes me wonder what that money went to. Missouri state right to try law. I think it's only fair that if we talk about the patients who get access under right to try, we talk about the patients who did not get access. And this is a heartbreaking example. This is a man who had ALS, and I'll just read it to you. My dad had hoped for the first time since diagnosed with ALS when he found out that Missouri was a right to try state. He thought that because he was moving back to Missouri, he could try this drug. Bardone's neurologist tried to get more information about the drug, and the family made emotional requests to the company. Geneveron, however, refused to provide it, et cetera, et cetera. Can you imagine the hope we felt? Connor said, this entire process put the most emotional time in our lives on an even more emotional roller coaster. So there have been people who have thought that right to try actually meant you had a right to try something, only to find out that no, companies still retain the ability to say no. The oncology patient that I mentioned, the first patient we know who was treated under federal right to try law happened at UC Irvine. And interestingly, the California state right to try law requires IRB review. And actually, this is one thing I didn't mention. So right to try not only cuts out the FDA from reviewing applications, it also cuts out IRBs, institutional review boards. And for those of you who are not involved in clinical care, the institutional review board is the one who works on doing the informed consent documents so that patients understand that this is voluntary, it's experimental, it may not help, it may actually cause harms, etc. So most of the right to try laws have cut out IRB review, which means the only sort of oversight of this is the individual physician. But California is the only state right to try law to require IRB review. So this one case actually did have an IRB involved. We do not know who the patient was. He or she has chosen to remain anonymous. They have glioblastoma, which is a fatal brain cancer. The company involved was a Belgian company that creates customized vaccines, so a form of immunotherapy for this cancer. It's currently being tested in the United States in a phase 2 trial, so all of this seems completely reasonable. One would have to assume that the patient did not meet the enrollment criteria for the trial, which is why they were not able to get access via the trial. The company, however, had previously given access to their product in the United States to people who did not meet the trial enrollment criteria via expanded access. So the question was, well, why would a company that had done that in the past now do right to try? And reporters actually asked that question, and apparently the patient specifically asked not only for the vaccine, but asked for it via right to try. And apparently the physician was in favor of that. You can see the quote here that the physician, quote, believed that right to try offered a more expedited path to treatment, end quote. I find that a curious statement because given that this was a customized product, it's not like something that was being turned around overnight or even within a day or two, but no one asked me. And then the last patient, ALS patient, federal right to try. This is the most recent one that we know of, but as I said, I'm sure more right to try cases will pop up. This patient and I have a difference of opinion, and he has actually asked me not to mention him in public anymore, so I'm not going to. I'm just going to read you what a reporter said. Prominent right to try advocate is getting treatment under new law. One of the namesakes of the federal right to try law confirmed Tuesday that he gained access to an experimental treatment thanks to the new law. X, who has ALS, thanked the company Brainstorm for providing the treatment on Facebook. Brainstorm, which is currently running a phase 3 trial for a stem cell treatment for ALS, has said publicly it will not give the treatment to patients other than X under right to try. The company has cited financial difficulties providing the treatment to patients that cannot pay, but said that they would provide X access as a thank you for his advocacy around the law. So this is an example of a patient getting access to a product. It's also a case in which the company has said it will not be providing access to anyone else, that this was a one-off. So just in conclusion, after years of keeping track of these laws, my team and I have found our best guess is about 72 people who have gotten access under either the state or the federal right to try laws since 2014. And this is not a direct comparison because it's not, but just in contrast, under expanded access in the last year, 2018, we know that there was 1,522 requests. And remember, it's not a case of one request equals one patient. The patient number is larger than that. So I just want to compare these two numerators and keep in mind the denominator is the number of people in the United States who would like to try an investigational medical product outside of a clinical trial, and we have no idea what that number is. So it's impossible to do the math on this, but it's at least thought-provoking, I believe. And then, of course, other takeaways from this is that the Goldwater Institute, of course, scored a victory by getting this law passed, and they have now moved on to new territories. They are now trying the same state-by-state strategy to deregulate what pharmaceutical companies can say about off-label treatments. I believe they're up to 3 states now in which they've passed these laws, but I haven't really been keeping track. And the misinformation continues. So remember Jordan McLean, who we saw a minute ago being hugged by the president at the signing statement. We just had an article out several days ago, boy who inspired right to try law attends White House Easter egg roll. And you can see in the last line, Jordan ran up and down the White House lawn on Monday, something his mom says he was able to do because of the treatments they fought for, which is, again, a complete misrepresentation. Jordan's been getting access through a clinical trial, not right to trial. And when the clinical trial ended, he was moved into a post-trial expanded access program. So this is just a complete misrepresentation. And that's it. Happy to take questions during the Q&A.